Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History and will serve as your host today. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History on behalf of the New Mexico History Museum and through donations from our audience. These funds go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, the History Museum's programs and exhibits. Our speaker today is William Cavaliere, the current president of the Cochise County Historical Society and author of the book, The Chiricahua Apaches, A Concise History. He has also published articles in Wild West magazine and for several historical journals. As well, Bill has served as Sheriff of Hidalgo County, New Mexico. In his talk today, Mr. Cavaliere will be speaking on Chiricahua Apache origins, culture, and conflicts with Mexicans and Anglos, and the Apaches' ultimate surrender to captivity. So now, let's welcome Bill Cavaliere.
Thank you, Ben, for that very nice introduction. I appreciate it. Like you just mentioned, I'm president of the Cochise County Historical Society. I've held that position for 10 years now. And I live in Southeast Arizona, right in the former homelands of the Chiricahua Apaches. So all these years I've lived here, I've always heard about Cochise and Geronimo, and that sparked my interest in the history of the Chiricahuas. And it's a very, very rich history and a very interesting story, one full of uncanny twists of fate and a lot of emotion and sadness. But at any rate, I'd like to get started. So this is my presentation, The Chiricahua Apaches, A Concise History. It kind of follows along with my book. But let's first talk about who the Chiricahua Apaches were. The Chiricahua Apaches are the descendants of a group that migrated from Asia about 10,000 years ago. They came across the Bering Land Bridge into Alaska in North America. That Bering Land Bridge, geologists refer to that as Beringia. And these were a group called Athabascans, Athabascan-speaking people originating from Siberia. And they came into Alaska, Northwest Canada, and down into northern United States. And they terminated in the American Southwest and northern Mexico. There were the Athabascans, when they reached the American Southwest, divided into 7 tribes. And these 7 tribes were the Lipan Apaches, the Jicarilla Apaches, the Mescalero Apaches, the Navajos. A lot of people are surprised to hear that Navajos are Apaches, basically. The Western Apaches, the Kiowa Apaches, and the Chiricahua Apaches. They're the ones we're going to be concentrating on today. Now it gets a little more complicated. The Chiricahua Apaches further divided into 4 bands. And these bands were the Chokonen, which translates to the Red Cliff people, the Chehenne, or the Red Paint people, the Nedni, or the Enemy people, and the Badonkahe, the Earth They Own It people. Now, this is the range of the 4 bands of the Chiricahua Apaches. There's a small green area to the upper left. That's the range of the Badonkahe. The large blue area to the right, to the east, is the Chehenne, also known as the Warm Springs. They range all the way east to the Rio Grande. To the south, going down into Mexico, are the Nedni, and to the west, that brownish area, are the Chokonens. Probably the most famous Chokonen was Cochise. He was a chief who held complete control over his people. He was really a brilliant man, and we'll get into that later as far as his negotiating skills. This is a photograph of Fort Bowie in the late 1880s. Fort Bowie was kind of the nervous center of the operations of the United States military in their war against the Apaches. And there was an infamous incident called the Bascom Affair. And basically what happened at Bascom Affair was there was a boy that was kidnapped from a ranch. And Cochise was accused of kidnapping him. But it turned out it was not Cochise or his warriors. It was a totally different tribe. What happened near Fort Bowie was the famous Battle of Chiricahua Pass. Now, this is a bronze plaque that the Cochise County Historical Society dedicated at an event about 2 years ago. The Battle of Chiricahua Pass occurred when Cochise and about 100 of his warriors clashed with Captain Reuben Bernard and about 60 soldiers from Fort Bowie. And what makes the Battle of Chiricahua Pass so fascinating is the fact that it holds a record that more medals of honor were awarded to soldiers for a one-day battle than any other one-day battle in the entire history of the United States, including World War II and Vietnam and the Civil War. 33 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor, and this happened in the Chiricahua Mountains. Cochise, Reuben Bernard, when he wrote his after-action report, actually complimented Cochise, who was his enemy in the field, but he called Cochise the most intelligent, hostile Indian on the continent, and credited his warriors for being recklessly brave. So it's not every day that the general compliments the opposing side. So this plaque is, we wanted to put it up at the site, but it was on Forest Service land, and it was taking quite a bit of time. So it's now on the grounds of the Chiricahua Desert Museum. Cochise was able to negotiate with General Oliver Howard in 1872 to get a reservation made. Now, General Howard wanted Cochise and his warriors to move to the San Carlos Reservation, but Cochise had a counteroffer. And this is what I was mentioning earlier, how brilliant Cochise was. He said, "Why don't you give us our homelands for the reservation?" And Howard really couldn't argue with that. So the Chiricahua Apaches were given their traditional homelands as a reservation, and everybody was happy. The government had the Apaches on a reservation, and the Chiricahuas didn't have to move. And so everything was great until a couple of years after Cochise passed away. Now, this is Tom Jeffers. He was the only white man who was Cochise's friend. And he was able to get Cochise and General Howard together, and they sat on a flat rock in the Dragoon Mountains, and they made this historic peace treaty. This is a photograph of the Council Rocks, taken in 1895. There was no photographer in 1872 when it happened. And if you've been to the Dragoon Mountains, you'll know that it's just hundreds of square miles of rocks and boulders. And to find this actual place would be a needle in a haystack. But after 150 years or so, it was finally located. And to go there and know that Cochise himself actually sat on that rock, it's a pretty unique experience. And at the Cochise Stronghold, which is on U.S. Forest Service property, they have this wonderful plaque. Chief Cochise, the greatest of Apache warriors, died June 8, 1874, in his favorite stronghold. And then the very last line, it says, one white man, his blood brother, Thomas Jeffers. Well, the blood brother part is not accurate. The Chiricahua Apaches did not engage in that ceremony of blood brothers. There was a novel written called Broken Arrow, or I think it was called Blood Brother, with a fictionalized story of this. And the author, Elliot Arnold, had this fictitious ceremony in it. Unfortunately, it said about it on the plaque. Now, Cochise had two sons. His oldest one was Taza, and his youngest one was Naichi. This is a photograph of Naichi. When Cochise died in 1872 of natural causes, his two sons were at his side, and Cochise told his sons before he died to always live at peace with the white man. And when he died, Taza, being the oldest, became the chief. Taza went on a goodwill trip to Washington, D.C., and he contracted pneumonia there. And he's actually buried in a congressional cemetery in Washington, D.C. So with that, Naiche was elevated to the position of chief. Unfortunately, Naiche associated with Geronimo. Geronimo was not a chief. He never was. He was more of a medicine man, but he had a very loud and boisterous personality. And even though Naiche was a chief, he associated himself with Geronimo, and he was influenced by Geronimo. The Army had General George Crook assigned to pursue the Apaches. Geronimo, and I'm condensing this story, but Geronimo convinced Naiche to leave the reservation. In 1876, the government closed the reservation and forced the Apaches to move to San Carlos. And so Geronimo convinced Naiche and a group of others to flee the reservation and go to Mexico. This action, the government, I guess you could say, christened the Apaches who left as hostiles. There's that word, that term hostile, and that was assigned to any Apache to leave the reservation. General Crook was actually an advocate, even though he was fighting the Apaches and chasing them and trying to subdue them and bring them back to the reservation. He was also an admirer of the Apaches. The Apaches had to have a general who was after them. They were probably fortunate it was General Crook. He did not like wearing uniforms, as you can see in this photo. He preferred civilian clothes, although he didn't dress like this in the field. But he did research their culture, and he was an admirer of the Apaches. And every time he caught up with the Apaches, he tried to give them the best deal he could arrange for them. And he never tried to pull any tricks or treachery or surround them and kill them or anything like that. He always tried to negotiate with them and give them the best deal he could arrange. One of the things General Crook did was he started using Apache scouts. Prior to this, the Army was basically running around in circles. They could never catch up to the Chiricahua Apaches, the hostiles, and in that term today it's politically incorrect. But keep in mind, there were about 300 or 400 Chiricahuas who did not flee the reservation, that were living there peacefully. And so this small ragtag group with Geronimo and Naiche were the ones that the Army was after in Mexico. And so finally, the Apache scouts were the downfall of the hostiles. It wasn't until General Crook started using Apache against Apache that he was able to make some headway, and he was able to catch up to Geronimo and Naiche and their band. In March of 1886, General Crook did have a conference with Geronimo and Naiche about 20 miles south of the border at a place called Canyon de los Embudos, which is Spanish for the Canyon of the Funnels. It's a very remote area, very difficult to access today. I've been there several times. And this is an interesting photo. Fortunately, General Crook allowed a photographer to go on the expedition. The photographer's name was C.S. Fly, and he had a studio and tombstone next to the OK Corral. And in this photograph, you could see Geronimo sitting there. He's second from left. And the second from right is General Crook. He's wearing that, it looks like an African pit helmet. And they're squared off against each other. Everybody in this photograph has been identified. This is another photo. Prior one we saw was posed. This was the photographer Fly took this photo without posing anybody. This was when the actual negotiations were going on. And right in the front with his back to the camera in that black coat, that's Naiche. That's the chief. But he's not in that other photo. I don't know if he was did not want to be photographed or just didn't make it in time or what the story was. Well, the upshot was the Apaches agreed to surrender. General Crook went back to Fort Bowie to telegraph the president with the good news. Unfortunately, an unscrupulous trader by the name of Charles Triboulet, he would sell whiskey and tequila to both the soldiers and the Apache scouts. He sold the hostiles 15 gallons of whiskey and told them that if they surrendered, they were going to be killed, and they were planning on hanging them in the United States. He did this because he didn't want the war to end, or else he'd be out of a job selling his to the army. So the Apaches reneged, they changed their mind, and they escaped, fled back to Mexico. When they escaped, General Crook was pretty frustrated, and he resigned. So the army replaced him with General Nelson Miles. Miles was the complete opposite of Crook. Miles was a real glory seeker. He didn't mind if treachery was used. He didn't mind if the army surrounded and shot and killed the Apaches. He just wanted the glory of saying that he ended the Apache Wars, and he was the one that captured or killed Geronimo. Well, in September 4th, 1886, and again, I'm abridging the whole story. It's a long, complicated story. You could get the details in my book if you're interested. But the Apaches did surrender for the final time in Skeleton Canyon in Arizona. And General Miles realized the historical significance of the surrender. Every single Indian tribe in the United States from coast to coast had already surrendered. The Apaches were the very last holdouts. So when they surrendered in September 1884, that forever ended the Indian Wars. Now, when I say that, a lot of people ask me, well, what about Wounded Knee? That was in 1890. Well, those were Sioux Indians that had already surrendered. That was an uprising on a reservation, or you could call it a murder, a massacre on a reservation, but they weren't free-roaming Indians. So it is accurate to say that the Chiricahua Apaches, when they surrendered, forever ended the Indian Wars. And Miles had the officers pile up a monument, a pile of rocks, to commemorate the site where the Indian Wars forever ended. And it's there in the mouth of Skeleton Canyon. It's on private property. It's behind a locked gate. You cannot access it. Could at one time, but no longer. That's a photograph of the rocks in 1941. And here's a recent photograph of it today. You could see the pile of rocks is a lot lower. Back when it was open to the public, a lot of people took rocks as souvenirs, and it has this big mesquite bush growing out of the top of it. The closest you could get to it today is on Highway 80 in a rest area where this plaque is set on this monument. And in the 1940s, the monument was struck by lightning and the top of it was knocked off, but it's since been repaired. Getting back to the Apaches, they were taken from Fort Bowie to the town of Bowie, put on a train, and sent eastward to imprisonment in Florida. This is a rest stop in near San Antonio, Texas. They were allowed to leave the train to rest and then continued on their journey. This is a shot of them as POWs in Florida. Geronimo sitting on the cannon to the left, Naichi, the chief, in the middle, and Mangus on the right. Now, that's not Mangus Coloradus. A lot of people hear Mangus and they think it's Mangus Coloradus. Mangus Coloradus had long since passed away. This is his son. The Apaches in Florida, now keep in mind they were acclimated to the desert, the high mountains, and suddenly they're in Florida at sea level. They began developing respiratory illnesses. They began dying at an alarming rate. So General Crook came to the rescue, said they had to be moved out of Florida. Well, unfortunately, the Army moved them, but they moved them to Alabama. And Alabama turned out to be worse than Florida. And General Crook visited them in Alabama. And when he arrived there, the Apaches all gathered around him and were hoping that he would do something for them. And he said he would. Unfortunately, not long after he returned, he died of a heart attack. So he was stuck in Alabama for about 8 years. Eventually, they were finally moved to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And here's a photograph of Geronimo and Naichi in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. You can see Geronimo's signature. He learned to write his name in block letters. And if you look on the upper or on the lower right of the photograph, you can see Naichi signed it. He used cursive. He had a beautiful cursive signature, and he ended up as an artist. He did some beautiful artwork, paintings on deer hides. Geronimo passed away at Fort Sill in 1909, still a prisoner of war. is the photograph I took of his grave. And Nietzsche died 10 years later. The Chiricahuas were freed as POWs in 1913. So Nietzsche was a free man for 6 years. In 1913, the Chiricahua Apaches were given the option of staying at Fort Sill, or the Mescalero Apaches at south central New Mexico offered their reservation for them to move to, and about 70% moved there. Nietzsche was one of the ones that moved to the Mescalero Reservation. After they surrendered back in 1886, there was a group of them, 7 of them. I think it was 5 adults and a boy and an infant. And they, on their way to Fort Bowie, they snuck away and escaped. They were led by the one here in the center, Adonitze. And they became the nucleus of a group called the Bronco Apaches. And the Bronco Apaches led this perilous existence. They multiplied, and they would hide up in the mountains, and they would watch a ranch house, and they would raid the ranch house and steal and continue this type of existence. And the last Bronco Apache raid in the United States was in 1924, and the last one in Mexico was in 1937. The photograph I like of Nietzsche's grandson, Preston Nietzsche, he was in the Armored Division in the Korean War. And the Chiricahuas today mostly reside in the 2 places where they were when the POW status was removed, Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and Mescalero, New Mexico. I just add these photos in, part of their culture. The young women have the coming of age ceremony when they reach puberty. And for centuries, they have this ceremony where they build this giant teepee, and the young girl comes out as a sunrise. And I was invited to one of these ceremonies a couple of years ago at Mescalero, and I was amazed at how nothing pretty much has changed. If you look at that giant teepee where the red arrow is, it's a brush-covered teepee with a canvas top. And here's the one that I was fortunate enough to be able to assist in constructing, that they look like today. And you could see there's almost no change, including to the actual ceremony itself. So that concludes my presentation. And I'd like to thank Ben for asking me to be here today.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, for sharing this fascinating, informative, and empathetic narrative of the Chiricahua Apaches in their last years as an independent tribe, and in the early years under the reservation system.
With my pleasure.
I really commend you in terms of the photos and graphics. It really enriches the discussion and gives us a sense of place and time, and a visual in terms of, the context in which so many of the negotiations occurred.
Well, I chose a lot of the photographs. As far as the graphics and all, I have to give a shout out to Craig McEwen, the vice president of the Cochise County Historical Society. He put the PowerPoint together for me, my direction, but he's the wizard behind all that IT stuff that I have no idea how to do.
I assume that many of these are available in your book.
Yeah, a lot of the photos are in the book.
Wonderful. I think it's unique that you were able to find an actual photo, the one that C.S. Fly took of the first surrender negotiations and the follow-on negotiations. We rarely see those, and the clarity was excellent.
Yeah, I do another PowerPoint where I show those 1800 photos, and I show the color photo over today, and how the comparison, how they change over 150 years.
I do have a couple of questions. Of course, it's always struck me in terms of, we have, it's well known that the U.S. troops used other Apache natives as scouts. And could you go into a bit more detail in terms of, their motivations, but also in terms of further elaborating on why they proved so effective?
Sure. I mentioned during the presentation that we need to keep in mind that the vast majority of the Chiricahua Apaches were living peacefully on the reservation. I don't want to imply that the reservation was a good place, but they were living there at the direction of the government, and uh, when General Crook asked some of the warriors if they were willing to work as scouts, a lot of them jumped at the chance. Uh, the, Most of them did not agree with Geronimo and Naiche leaving the reservation. They thought that that was going to cause trouble for them, the peaceful ones, not only for the ones they call the hostiles, but they thought that they were going to have to pay for what Geronimo and Naiche were doing. And it turned out at the end that's exactly what happened. So they wanted Geronimo and Naiche stopped. The scouts did. They also they thought they were crazy for leaving the reservation and having to be sleeping with one eye open, so to speak, while the army chased them. Not only the American army, but the Mexican army, always on the run, where they were living contentedly on the reservation. Again, not the best place, but they weren't being chased and shot at. So they agreed to assist the government. And that's the main reason why the scouts, it also broke the boredom of the reservation. That's the main reason why the scouts agreed to work as scouts. Tragically, after Geronimo Naiche surrendered, the army had no more use for the scouts. So instead of just for the Chiricahua Scouts, there were other Apache tribes, White Mountain Scouts and Mescalero Scouts. But as far as the Chiricahua Scouts went, the government, General Sheridan and President Grover Cleveland, they would just hear the word Chiricahua and they wanted all of them out of their hair and away, sent away. And so one of the most shameful incidents in the history of our country was the army gathered up all of those loyal scouts and sent them off as prisoners as well. Absolutely amazing that that happened. I mean, they were probably thinking they were going to be receiving medals, and instead, after all the hard work they did for the army, they were sent off to the same place that the hostiles were sent. And General Crook, goes without saying, was absolutely livid, but there was nothing he could do. He was overruled.
That is very much a sad commentary.
Very sad story.
As is the whole that whole period, which of course is people are particularly sensitive to today in terms of understanding the dynamic. Clearly, U.S. policy was to pacify, and in many ways that proved far too brutal in the way in which was accomplished. I was struck by it's really a capsule of the internal tensions within the U.S. You have General Crook, who was empathetic with the Apaches, and did his best within the context of his orders. And then you have General Miles, who was insensitive to that and motivated more by his own personal advancement. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything further on that.
Yeah, General Miles was a real glory seeker. They said he had presidential aspirations. He did most of his dealing with the Chiricahua Apaches, at least. He dealt with Native American tribes all over the country. But with the Chiricahua Apaches, he did most of his work from within the forts, and he delegated these different captains and lieutenants out to do the footwork. But then once Geronimo was brought to Skeleton Canyon, Geronimo and Naiche, he, he sent word from Fort Bowie, let me know when they're at Skeleton Canyon, then I'll come and receive the surrender. So he had nothing to do with the actual footwork. And once he got a message that they were waiting at Skeleton Canyon, Miles came, accepted the surrender, and took the glory. And the real officer who did all the hard work riding up and down the mountains in Mexico, that was Gatewood, Lieutenant Charles Gatewood. Miles actually sent him off to Fort Wingate so that he would be away and not able to spread the word who really was behind the success of getting negotiating the surrender. So Gatewood was kind of the unsung hero. And Gatewood also respected, he was a Crook man. He had worked for Crook and learned to respect the Apaches. He worked on the reservation, learned to speak Apache. And so it seemed like the Army wanted any of these officers who admired the Apaches sent away. So yeah, Miles took the credit, and the grateful citizens of Tucson had a big ceremony, and they took donations to get a sword engraved and present him with this sword. And the engraving, they didn't raise enough funds, so Miles paid out of his own pocket to finish the engraving on the sword, and then he accepted the gift.
So, Bill, I really want to thank you for taking the time to provide this clear and concise narrative of this painful period in our history, particularly in and around southern Arizona. Do you have any last minute comments that you'd like to make?
Well, the Chiricahua Apaches today, I think I mentioned at the end of my presentation, they're living in around Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and Mescalero, New Mexico, which is near the resort town of Ruidoso, and they seem to be thriving. Neither Fort Sill or Mescalero are at their original homelands, where I showed the map in the beginning, which is called Apacheria. And so they are wanting to get a foothold back in their traditional homelands, and I'm assisting them. And it would be nice to see that happen. Yeah, that's basically it. It's a fascinating story, fascinating history. You read it and it reads like a fiction novel. It's hard to imagine that some of these things really occurred.
Well, again, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to the Friends of History.
It's been our pleasure. Now, for our audience, in closing, we'd like to remind you to visit our webpage at the Friends of History nm.org, shown below, where you can rewatch this lecture and other Friends of History First Wednesday lectures, which cover a wide range of topics about New Mexico and more broadly, the Southwest. Just click on the lecture series link at the top of the Friends of History homepage, then go to past lectures to see the list and enjoy the presentation. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures, or more broadly about the Friends of History itself, we encourage you to join our mailing list by emailing us at the link below. Finally, we request that you consider making a donation to the Friends of History through our website so that the Friends of History can continue to support programs at the New Mexico History Museum. Just go to the donation page on our website homepage, and you will see that below. And thank you to all for contributing to Friends of History for this presentation and for other presentations in the past. We look forward to seeing you all in the months ahead. Thank you and goodbye for now.